Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
Hi everybody, and welcome to this very special episode of The Art of Procurement. And thank you so much for tuning in, whether you're working out, commuting, doing chores, or just sat at your desk listening while churning out some emails. I'm forever thankful that you do tune in and listen to the show. And today's show is actually a continuation of the series of episodes that I've recorded on the topic of value-based procurement. And you might recall back in episode 66 that I discussed with Joanna Martinez, the ex-CPO and founder of Supply Chain Advisors, and also Jordan Early of Old Street Labs, the different ways that procurement can drive value over and above cost savings. One of those methods is to think differently about your most strategic supplier relationships. When I think of experts in the field of driving innovation through collaborative supplier relationships, the first person that always comes to my mind is today's guest, Kate Vitasek. And Kate currently serves as a faculty member in the University of Tennessee's graduate and executive education programs. But Kate's best known as the founder and lead researcher in the concept of vested, otherwise known as vested outsourcing, which Kate and her team and collaborators developed in conjunction with the University of Tennessee. And the vested concept has become what I believe is the leading methodology for companies wanting to build true strategic partnerships with their most material suppliers. It encourages a completely different way of thinking and different rules to really transition from being in a buyer and a seller relationship to one where it's truly a win-win relationship. And one of the great things about Kate's research is that it's underpinned by many, many real-world examples that show how companies, both large companies and small companies, are transforming their supplier relationships and also the subsequent value that's generated from those engagements. Well, Kate has published 5 books to date on the vested concept. She's appeared on CNN, NPR, Bloomberg Radio and Fox News. Her work's been featured in over 300 publications, including the Wall Street Journal and Forbes, where she's a regular contributor. And prior to joining the University of Tennessee, Kate enjoyed a career on the corporate side, with positions at companies such as P&G, Microsoft and Accenture. So it really is quite some background. And I first came across Kate's work back in 2010. I was a sourcing and category manager. I'd just taken over my financial services firm's portfolio of business process outsourcing and offshoring suppliers. We had a number of strained supplier relationships. I was really looking for some ideas of really how to change, how to build stronger relationships with those suppliers. And I was pointed in the direction of this new book called Vested Outsourcing, which was Kate's first publication. And Kate's approach really stood out to me, and I've followed her work ever since. So I'm delighted to welcome Kate to the show today to talk in more detail about the art, the science, and the practice of crafting strategic supplier relationships. Before I roll the tape, if this is the first time you've listened to The Art of Procurement, I just wanted to welcome you to the show. If you like what you hear, you can sign up to be notified every time a new episode is published. Just go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe. That's artofprocurement.com/subscribe. All right then, let's get on with the show. So hi everybody and welcome to The Art of Procurement. And as I mentioned in my introduction, I'm excited to be joined today on the show by Kate Vitasek. Kate, welcome to the show.
Fantastic. Nice to be here.
Thanks. And I gave some of your background during my introduction. And something that surprised me when I was researching the show was that you were on the corporate side before making the move into education. So I had a couple of questions about that. First is, what was the focus of your career while you were on the corporate side?
Well, that's kind of, you just come out of graduate school and you go down a corporate path and that's where it started. And I actually ironically started as a consultant and then went to work for the buy side. I went to work for Microsoft, right. And then Microsoft's largest supplier, came back to be a consultant, and then skipped out to academia. So I've kind of gone full circle, and I think it actually gives me a really good perspective because I've literally been on all sides of sourcing and outsourcing initiatives.
So why make the change? What happened that made you want to make the switch to academia from the corporate side?
Well, I've always really liked teaching, and I had a strong affiliation with the University of Tennessee, where I graduated from. And the dean of the College of Business actually called and asked me to participate and lead a research project from a research perspective and a project management perspective. Right. So the Air Force had funded this really, really large initiative to study complex outsourcing deals. And he didn't have anyone on staff, and many of the faculty had recommended me, knowing that I'd been kind of on the buy side and the sell side of some complex outsourcing deals, and so it was a good fit. And I had loved teaching. I'd always gone back and guest taught at the university, and so I just kind of fell into it, and I've been there since 2003.
Right, and so I didn't realize it was the work with the Air Force that really brought you into the University of Tennessee from an education perspective, and was that the beginning of what the vested movement became?
It is. We didn't think about it being vested at the time. It was a simple request from the Air Force to study large outsourcing deals, particularly in the area of logistics and maintenance support. Mm-hmm. So think about it. They buy an airplane. It's $100 million, and it was really costing them $800 million because of all the logistics and the support, and most of that is all outsourced today. And so very, very complex deals that just, I always like to say you get what you pay for.
Right.
So you have to step back and say, well, what did we do wrong in this process? So it's kind of a process perspective, a contracting perspective, a post-contract management perspective. So really looking holistically across the entire process of buying and servicing and maintaining these complex outsourcing relationships that got us into it. And from there, we started to look at non-logistics types of deals. And we found that it's exactly the same problem. And I knew that from my background, having worked for Microsoft and outsourced many different types of services that they had, that the problems are really across all types of deals. I don't care if it's IT or BPO or supply chain or logistics or facilities management. And so it was pretty easy to make the leap out of that original funded research into looking at all types of outsourcing deals. And that's where we got the idea of vested, is because no matter where we look, the best deals, the buyer and the supplier had this really collaborative, very strategic, vested interest in each other's success.
And so what were some of the things that you consistently saw buy-side doing wrong when you looked at all these examples?
Well, it's a great question, Phil. One of the things that they do is they believe they have to go through this really extremely competitive bid process. Yeah. And so in order to compare apples to apples, they have to dictate the what and the how. And so what that does is it actually cuts the supplier's legs out from underneath them from driving solutions and being creative innovation. So they say they want innovation, and then they sit there and give you a spec on how to do it. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's insane, right? Another thing that they do is really get stuck in transactional contracts and transactional pricing models. So they want business outcomes, but then when they turn around and go through the negotiation and pricing exercises in the contract, they actually bought a transaction.
Right.
And again, cuts them off at the legs.
Yeah, and that's what the process is all built to support.
Absolutely.
So you mentioned a little bit about vested outsourcing just a minute or so ago. What I'd love to do before we drill down into more details is just understand the principles at maybe a high level of what vested outsourcing was and maybe what it's become.
Well, it's interesting because people go, well, that's just radical common sense. Did you really invent that? And I always say, we didn't invent anything.
Right.
We studied really successful organizations, and we studied those that were struggling. And from that research, we codified the vested methodology, which is where we at the university try to teach people the art, science, and practice of how to craft these strategic relationships. Now, out of the gate, we called it vested outsourcing because the focus was on these outsourcing deals. But over time, what we saw is that a lot of organizations didn't think of their strategic partnerships as outsourcing. McDonald's is a great example. McDonald's looks at it as like, We do. We have vested relationships with our suppliers, but we don't outsource anything.
Right.
And I just looked at him. I said, "You don't outsource it. You outsource everything, 100%."
Right.
But the word outsourcing, people think about IT outsourcing and offshoring. Yeah. And so we've kind of dropped the word outsourcing and just say a vested sourcing business model. And when you look at that model, what is a vested model or vested outsourcing? What is it? And it was really 5 things. And these things are so essential, we call them rules, that you're cheating if you don't follow the rules.
Right.
So when you say you want innovation, when you say you want a strategic partners, these deals have to be crafted differently than you're buying a pen or a widget or something else. And so those rules, rule number 1 is focus on outcomes and not transactions. So a transaction is an activity. You buy a widget, a per unit, a per mile, a per hour, right? An outcome is a business objective. You're trying to really achieve something in the business, and you have to do all these activities to achieve that, but you're not buying an activity. Right. You're buying an outcome. So focus on the outcomes, not the transactions, rule number 1.
And so do you have to change the way that so let's say a procurement person is leading an initiative and leading some sourcing, that the ultimate goal is to have a relationship that is focused on outcomes. So as a procurement organization, do you have to change the way that you're measured, because the way you measure this relationship may be different than how you've measured the relationships in the past?
Phil, that's an absolutely fantastic question, and the answer is yes. So one of the number 1 measures of procurement buyers is purchase price variance. Right. So 3% year over year price reduction. And so what if you could craft a deal to drive the cost structure down? And so now we decouple the supplier's profit from the cost. And so if that supplier can cut your costs by 20, 30, 50%, which we've seen done, right, you actually want to give that supplier a bonus, an incentive. And so when I look at price, a price couples the cost and that margin. And so you're not really getting to the core total cost of ownership, the value associated with that. What if the supplier's cost went up 5%, but they helped you go from worst to first on J.D. Power's rankings?
Right.
I mean, that could have been huge value. And so we need to start looking at value and outcomes as it relates to what the company's business objectives are, not just about the price. And so all too often procurement is measured on purchase price variance. And it's really counter to what some of the business needs are.
Have you seen examples of procurement organizations who have been able to change that? And I'm not necessarily suggesting that you suddenly change overnight from being measured on cost savings to value, because I don't think that that's just realistic. But yet it's kind of a journey. Those that have been successful in doing it, how have they started on that journey of making their organizations think differently?
Well, I like to think of it as one deal at a time, one strategic relationships at a time. So rather than just go, we're going to just move to value thinking, right? Let's take a relationship, where you have strategic stake in the ground to do something different, and really look at that and restructure that one relationship holistically. And in that case, the procurement person's bonus may have to change from that. And that's what we're seeing is it's not, companies are not just across the board magically going, I'm adopting vested and for everything and moving to value-based and moving to outcome-based for everything. They are looking at all the things they do and say, here are 3 relationships where I need to do this. Let's pilot it once, get it right, do it again with the second one, do it again with the third one. And so outcomes are really very strategic business objectives. And, if you're buying a pen, you don't need an outcome. Right. You need a pen.
Yeah. Is there a way to determine who that test case is going to be? Or is it just based on maybe who's a little bit more open-minded in terms of a stakeholder?
That is a great question. So there are some attributes that you would look at to see if a spend category should move to outcome-based. But in reality, most people kind of know in their head, right? They're the ones that have big impact, high risk, a lot of variability, you're frustrated. Many times the ones that people are piloting are ones where they have, they're frustrated. Yeah. So they know they've been working with a good supplier, but they're like, but why aren't you innovative? And it's a structural flaw because they didn't buy outcomes and innovation. They bought cost per hour.
Yeah.
They're going to get a lot of hours because they bought price per hour. And so it's usually these ones where people feel stuck, that they're willing to do something different. I have a video from Intel, and they go, there's only 5 suppliers that can do what we need in the spend category, and we've gone through all 5. What do? Go back to the one we fired?
Right.
Maybe I need to do something different.
Yeah. Interesting. So what was the second rule?
So rule number 2 is focus on the what, not the how. So if you want to achieve an outcome, right, this business need, objectives, I like to think of it as going to Mount Everest or going to the moon, right? So you have this goal, these big, lofty outcomes that you want to achieve. So if I tell you how to do it, you've basically put the supplier in a box.
Yeah.
Right? So they have to deliver to the spec. And what you want to do is have them challenge that and drive innovation to solve how you get to the moon or climb Mount Everest, because you haven't done it before. So we actually are seeing people move away from traditional specifications, detailed statement of works, to what we call workload allocations, a statement of objectives. Mm-hmm. So you're really trying to understand the objectives and the accountability for the work. So I'm not going to tell you how many times to clean the toilets. I'm going to say I need the toilets clean.
Yeah. Because that throws a lot of things as procurement professionals. We like to be able to do apples to apples comparisons and look at our spreadsheet and say, well, the numbers show supplier A is clearly better than supplier B because that's what the ROI looks like. How do we change our thinking when you're not now measuring apples to apples? You're basically saying, here's a challenge. What solution should I be considering to meet that challenge, and how do I know that that's the right one?
Yeah, and this is where you have to start thinking about total cost of ownership and best value analysis. So some of those more advanced kind of analysis tools that we use in strategic sourcing. And again, Vested isn't for every supplier. P&G has 80,000 suppliers. They're not going to have 80,000 vested deals. I think they have 16 suppliers that they call and reference as their gold mine suppliers, these really strategic suppliers. So vested is for those very strategic suppliers. And so you need to slow down and look at total cost of ownership, best value analysis on those strategic deals.
Yeah.
So rule number 3 is clearly defined and measurable desired outcomes. So if you're going to buy outcomes, you're going to shift from transactional activity thinking to outcomes, you have to be able to measure success. What is success? How do I know, I got to the top of Mount Everest? Is it when you stuck the flag in and got a picture, right? Did you see on the TV, someone walking across the moon when you got there? So how are you going to measure that? And unfortunately, this goes hand in hand with rule number 1, because if we buy activities and transactions, we typically measure activities. How many times did you clean the bathrooms?
Right.
Right? And so you may have in your office building a bathroom that needs to be cleaned every hour because it has so much traffic, and one that only needs to be cleaned once a day. And so we're letting the supplier now come up with ways that they are going to measure the success of what you're doing. And a lot of people are putting in analytics. I'm picking on bathroom cleaning, but every company needs their bathrooms cleaned, right? Yeah. So everybody can relate to that. And so what you're seeing is companies and the supplier invest in analytics, right? And so they can tell how many people have been in that restroom. And so if no one goes into that restroom for the day, they're just going to come clean it at the end of the night, right? And so you're starting to look at companies investing in analytics to really get the end result, not just to show up and do the activity.
And so I was going to ask a question about how do you make sure that those are achievable? It sounds like analytics is a way to do that. Are most companies that mature that they think in that way in terms of making those outcomes achievable, the measurables achievable?
Well, analytics can help the supplier actually find a better way to get to those outcomes, but sometimes they're just known. A great example, and we've seen this in a couple of deals, is J.D. Power's ranking.
Yeah. Right?
So if I'm a bank and I process credit cards, well, J.D. Powers gets to survey all the customers out there to say who they like best.
Yeah.
So if you're outsourcing your call center, JD Powers is pretty important because you want to have high rankings. Same thing, TD Bank, one of their goals is JD Powers rankings. Because when you go into a TD Bank branch, they're the better bank. They want to have a clean presence. They want that to be a comfortable place. You can have little toys for your kids to play while you're doing your banking business. And so the impact that you have from the building's perspective, it's not just about cleaning the toilets. It's about, is that building doing what it's needing to drive satisfaction? Yeah. And so sometimes it's an external metric. Often we actually want to see the end customer defining those measures of success. So it's not just, I did this activity, but did it achieve the end game from the end user? A great example would be dining, right? So P&G has a very well-known and touted deal with Jones Lang LaSalle, and their dining supplier is Compass on that. And who tells if the dining and catering is good? It is not P&G shared services that's doing it. It's the employees who eat there every day. So they vote with their money, saying, "I love to stay in and eat at the cafeteria because the food is healthy, it's inexpensive, and it's convenient."
This episode of The Art of Procurement is made possible by the Procurement Revolution. And it's no secret that procurement's at a crossroads. We want to better align ourselves with strategic corporate objectives, and yet not lose sight of our core mission, to positively impact the operating efficiency of the enterprise. And there's been plenty of discussion and a lot of talk, but the time has come for us to act. Procurement needs a revolution from within. The Procurement Revolution is a 100% online, multi-channel event taking place in late September 2016. It's hosted by the Art of Procurement and Buyers Meeting Point. We aim to challenge the status quo and encourage procurement professionals around the world to stand up, speak out, and drive change. We're already building a strong faculty of thought leaders to spread the word and participate in the procurement revolution. One of those is my guest on today's Art of Procurement show, Kate Vitasek. Did I mention the event is free? We want to maximise the reach on what we believe is a topic that is critically important to the future of procurement. To join Kate at the Procurement Revolution, visit theprocurementrevolution.com. That's theprocurementrevolution.com.
So, Phil, let's go on to the big ticket item that everyone talks about. Right. It's rule number 4, pricing model with incentives. So one of the things that we do here is we shift the thinking from price to a pricing model. It's in strategic relationships, if I set a price, business is dynamic, right? There's risk, there's change. And so a price is great that day you set the price and had the contract, but then tomorrow or the next month, the next year, it's out of equilibrium. And so we really look to shift to a pricing model, and that pricing model should have incentives. So when the buyer wins, the supplier wins. You win together, you lose together.
So how much, or is there a magic number that you encourage organizations to think about in terms of how much is a fixed cost and how much is at risk or incentive based?
So we love, first let me say there's different ways to structure pricing models. And in our courses, we teach that. We actually show 3 different examples. So we use a Dell example, a P&G example, and a Microsoft example of how they've gotten to pricing models with incentives. So we give some real examples. But one of our favorites is a cost pass-through. So the cost is a cost is a cost. There's no markup. So if electricity tripled, right? So Jones Lang LaSalle didn't take the risk on electricity. But what I do want to do is put an incentive for Jones Lang LaSalle to drive efficiency in utilization of electricity. So they're offsetting my risk that electricity is increasing. So as a general rule of thumb, what we see on a cost pass-through model is that the supplier's profit is about half of what market margin would be. So if I bid this out and I wanted a price, the supplier might have a cost of $1 and a margin of 10 cents. right? So they had a 10% margin. So under a vested model, it would be the cost is the cost is the cost. It's a dollar, but tomorrow it could be 90 and the next day it could be $1.10. But their margin is half of market. So instead of that 10% that they got in that competitive bid, they're actually using about half of the market. So they're making less money. Mm-hmm. So as a supplier now, I'm agreeing to work in a very strategic, transparent, cost pass-through model with you for about half of market margin. And you go, well, as a supplier, why would I do that? That's crazy. And it's not crazy because you actually get a ton of great incentives. So our upside for the supplier would be what we think of as a rule of thumb, 3x market margin. So if I'm going to do the work for 5%, but market's 10, I'm going to have incentives up to 30% margin. So if I can move up and achieve your J.D. Powers rankings, if I can make your employees so excited to stay on campus to be in the dining area, which, by the way, think about a big company who has dining facilities. If they can get more people to stay on campus, that's about 10 minutes a day.
Yeah.
Right? That's huge in productivity, right? So you're looking at those big ticket outcomes, but there's no guarantee for those, and you have to work together. So we want to put really large incentives for the supplier to work with you in a highly collaborative way to achieve those big ticket items.
And I guess the other thing it does for the supplier is that it helps them manage their risk, because that number is going to be set. They're going to have a baseline of, say, 5% margin, whatever happens to the cost. So they don't have to price this based on the fact, well, all these things may change and I'm going to be the one holding the bag because I can't change my prices accordingly. So having that minimum floor of a margin is probably worth it to them to have a smaller margin in the short term.
Yeah, and actually when a supplier, and this is a big mistake that buyers make, right? They think, well, I'm going to push the risk over to the supplier. Mm-hmm. Well, if you push uncontrollables, like electricity, we don't know if it's tripling or halving, right? So over time, we don't know snow removal. Is it going to snow 20 times or 2? Yeah. Right? And so if you shift that risk to the supplier and you make a supplier put a price against that, they have to guess and put a risk premium, and they're going to guess high.
Yeah.
And so buyers actually get the best deal when they take the non-controllable risk and they then have the supplier take the controllable risk. What can you do to control and manage and mitigate my risk? And I'm going to take the uncontrollable. And so when the supplier then, think of it as levers, right? So now they're working on the levers. Jones Lang LaSalle's doing all kinds of great, innovative, creative things to improve energy efficiency for Procter & Gamble. And when they achieve those goals, they get an incentive.
Right. So how do you encourage your CFO to take the non-controllable risk? Because that seems like the opposite of what they would likely like to do. They want to move all the risk away from their organization.
They just have to sit back and understand the logic behind it. Mm-hmm. So yeah, they can, especially if they're a really big company with lots of power, they can shift all the risks they want. But let's then put them in the supplier's seat and say, all right, so CFO, you just took on all this risk. What are you going to do? You're going to put a price premium in. Yeah. Is that what you want? Do you want them to guess? And so by having transparency around the economics, discussing risk, identifying risks, working together to mitigate and manage the risk, right? You actually hugely improve your odds of lowering your cost structure and decreasing those risks.
So how do we pull all this together then in terms of supplier management?
Well, that's where rule number 5 comes in, which is insight versus oversight governance structure. And the trend these days is just what you said, supplier relationship management, SRM. But in these really strategic relationships, we move to kind of a more advanced step than SRM into what we call governance, right? So these large outsourcing deals don't just need you to manage the supplier, right? It's not supplier management or supplier relationship management. It's governance. It's managing the business with the supplier. And this is another big mistake that we have. We outsource to the experts, and then we're telling them how to do the work, and we're micromanaging them. Right. Right. And so what we need to do is actually be enablers of these experts. So when the supplier has issues, your job is to break down the barriers. Your job is to support them instead of going, well, you didn't do this and you didn't do that. And so we get into this nitpicky micromanagement, and then the A team, who was so excited to bring innovations and ideas that, and I hear this all the time. The buyer said, you sold me the A team and now I have the C team, right? Well, no wonder the C team's there, because you ran off the A team.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to bring their best and brightest people to someone who's going to micromanage them.
No, they'll take them somewhere else.
Exactly. And so what we see is a conscious shift from oversight to insight, right? Collaboration, analytics, problem solving, root cause analysis. So don't just assume the supplier failed. When you start to do the root cause analysis, you realize that your inputs were 50% of the errors for the supplier. Right. And so we always jump into this, supplier penalty, they have a red scorecard. But when you actually get to the deep root cause analysis, the buyer often had inputs to the supplier that were causing them to fail.
Yeah, and that's key. I've been fortunate enough to be on both sides of the outsourcing table as well, both buying and providing. And, I'd always look at relationships where they're least successful, and those are ones where you buy an outsourced service. It can be a knowledge base, it can be BPO, it can be whatever, but then you bring on your provider, you have your contract, and you kind of wash your hands and say, okay, go and deliver. And you're really setting it up to fail right there, because it's still, even though you've outsourced to a third party, it needs a lot of collaboration to actually be able to execute, so the service provider can execute on what it is you've asked them to do.
Yeah, and you know what? That's a great point, because it's really, there's those who micromanage and there's those who just throw it over the fence. Right. And really it's somewhere in the middle there. It's you still need governance, but it should be insight, governance, collaboration, problem solving, root cause analysis. What's preventing you from getting to your Mount Everest, right? What do I need to do today in order to remove a barrier tomorrow to get to the moon, right?
So we have the 5 different rules of vested, but if you had 30 seconds, you have an elevator pitch, how would you sum up what vested is? And also I think how companies should start thinking about it and benefit from it.
Well, vested is a highly collaborative business model to drive win-win relationships. Mm-hmm. You win together, you lose together. And so think of it as a different game you're playing, right? So I can play a buy-sell game, or I can play a win-win game.
Yeah.
And so if you're going to play a win-win, you want innovation, strategic, you want outcomes, it's a different game, different rules.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's key, and we talked a lot about collaboration, and I was actually interested to kind of move into collaboration and collaborative relationships, because I think that the principles of vested are around the desire to create those collaborative relationships with the supply base. And I know you've kind of taken it a little bit deeper into terms of how do you build collaboration. And so I was interested to know, what does collaborative relationships actually mean? Because I think they mean different things to different people.
That's a great question, because a lot of people think collaboration is, well, I'm having a meeting, right? But when you get in these really strategic relationships and you are trying to drive innovation, you're co-creating. So it's not just having a meeting together, it's how you actually work together, how you make decisions together, how you do funding together. So that's why the rules are so important to these relationships. So if I look at the backbone from a contractual perspective, we actually advocate for relational contracts, right? So you can have a transactional contract or a relational contract. So a vested is a relational contract. So you're, in essence, buying the relationship over time to achieve some outcomes.
Yeah.
And so those rules show how you're going to work together over the life of that relationship to achieve those outcomes. And so in a relation contract, you're actually going to negotiate and lay the foundation for that relationship. And that starts with 6 guiding principles. Mm-hmm. So, and they're based on social norms and ethics, right? So think about reciprocity, right? So a win-win relationship. If I'm going to invest, you're going to invest. I'm not just going to shift risk to you and you take all the risk, right? There's no reward.
Right.
So reciprocity, we win together, we lose together. Autonomy, not using your power. This is really hard for a lot of big companies because the bigger you are as a buyer, the more you want to use your leverage and power. I mean, think about Peter Kraujik. It was all about leverage, right? Using your power.
Yeah.
And so in these big, really strategic relationships, just because you have the power, if you use that power and you abuse that power, like GM, famous for losing supplier trust, right? They abuse their power, that autonomy. Suppliers don't want to work for them, and they just game the system.
Yeah, I have a lot of experience actually in the auto industry, and you just see it left, right, and center. And there's some providers there that are trying to move away from that model, but it means that there's just no trust in the relationship. And as procurement folks, especially within automotive, but I know that it's not just an automotive issue. We're trained to use power dynamics to find points of leverage, to create a little bit of smoke and mirrors. Has that been difficult when you are teaching and training, I guess, individuals more than organizations in moving from a, let's say, a one-sided relationship to a two-sided collaborative relationship?
Yeah, and this is why we actually often start with the guiding principles. So when you're crafting that relationship, the first thing you do is you agree that you want to have a vested relationship. It is strategic in nature. It will be a win-win. And the second thing you do is create what we call a statement of intent. And that leads with these 6 guiding principles.
Right.
So you're talking through each one of these social norms, and you're actually writing the definitions and what they mean, and they become part of your contract. So I'm going to contractually lay the foundation for a win-win, for reciprocity, for not using power, right? And you talked about trust, right? And that's something that's been in the press a lot lately, especially in not just in the press, but books and articles. And so if you look, one of the guiding principles is honesty, right, and integrity. You're purposely agreeing to have honest and to drive honesty into that relationship. So not to withhold information. You're being transparent. You want the other party, you want your supplier to understand the facts as you see them so that they can make good decisions. We want equity, fairness. So when we think about the pricing model, what is fair? Yeah. You take a risk. I've got to make sure that I'm giving you appropriate return on your investment for that risk.
We talked about trust, and I think trust underpins a lot of the principles, and that doesn't happen overnight. What happens when a buyer and a seller, and let's say an incumbent, sit around the table for the first time and start trying to draft these principles? Is it all pretty foreign to them, or is there a desire to make something like this work?
I think it's both. So it is foreign, but there is desire. So without the desire, they won't try to do something different. And that's what we do at the University of Tennessee. We want to teach people how to get unstuck in these relationships, or to move from, I have the intention to create this strategic thing, but my existing contracts are all very transactional. It's like putting a square peg in a round hole.
Right.
So by going through our courseware, and we have both online and on-site courses, but the buyer and the supplier can sit and learn and then do. So we use a technique we call real play. And so you bring your deal and you learn, and then you real play with your deal, and then you answer questions, you do deliverables. So the deliverables are actually the schedules in your contract, right? So there's the 5 rules, and there's 10 contractual components. And so for each contractual component, you're learning and doing, learning and doing, learning and doing. And by the end of the course, you've actually crafted a contract. And so it's helping people unlearn their old ways and learn the new way.
I think from my experience, I would imagine that having this being a facilitated process makes it a lot more powerful. Can companies do this on their own, sit around a table, or is this just there's so much newness, for the want of a better word, involved in this way of thinking that it really needs a third party or an outsider or somebody who's not been emotionally vested in the relationship to now to come and help the parties come together and start thinking like this?
Yeah, I can tell you it is absolutely easier if you do have a neutral third-party facilitator. We actually, just like Six Sigma Black Belts, we train what we call certified deal architects that are trained in our methodology to coach these types of relationships and architect these relationships. But we have people who've taken our courses, our online course, or read a book and done a deal. One great example is Discovery Health Medical Scheme. They're the largest insurer in South Africa. 53% of the market share. The CEO, someone gave him a book and said, hey, you should think about this.
Right.
And they crafted a vested deal. And last year I got an email and I had a conversation with the CEO of Discovery Health Medical Scheme. He goes, we love vested. We used your book and it was awesome. He goes, but I think I might have, did I have any holes in it? Did I do it right?
Right.
So they're starting to come back and go, did I do this right? And so in his case, he came back, had us do a review, and there were some things that they didn't quite get as perfect as they could. And so by doing that review, now they can go and close those gaps. And we'll have a case study on that coming out later on this summer. But yeah, so people do, pick up a book or take our courses and do that. Our courses are designed online for a reason. It's because we can't, we don't expect everyone to come to Knoxville,
right,
to take our courses. And so that's why we have our Creating a Vested Agreement, where the buyer and the supplier can create a team. They learn, they do. So they just walk through the online course and they've created their agreement. Now, for strategic, very large deals, lots at stake, I'd say a good half of all of the deals that we know of are choosing to use a certified deal architect coach to help them. And it's just because it's easier. A little kid doesn't just pick up a rake and just start writing, right? He usually has his dad or mom behind him, and he's, kind of teaching him the ropes for a little bit. And that's what we do, is we act as a coach. And we have centers of excellence and our trained trainers that go in and help coach to do that. And our goal is then that by going through a process, the buyer and the supplier would then have people who've done it, so they move from being green belts to black belts. And so in essence, they now have people on their staff.
And it goes back to what you said before. Once you've done it once or twice, then that provides the results and the outcomes that you've delivered from those instances, those projects or the suppliers, then provide the incentive to go and do it further into your organization across further suppliers. So we were both tagged last week in a LinkedIn comment that I just wanted to ask you about, and it was we were tagged along with Rob Hanfield, who was another former guest on the Art of Procurement, and the comment was about whether or not procurements really we only consider building stronger relationships when there's time of crisis. So in other words, when there's something in it for me, it's not necessarily when there's something in it for the supplier. And Rob shared a blog post about the cost of collaboration. I know that's something that I hear often is, well, this is all well and good, but can I afford the investment? You touched on it before. One of the questions I had was, is there any types of supplier relationships that you encourage organizations to consider versus others where they don't, where you really shouldn't be thinking about this, the collaborative nature of relationships or building collaborative relationships?
So anytime that you really want innovation, if it's something that should be a core competency but you can't do for various reasons, great example would be in the pharmaceutical industry with clinical trials and clinical research outsourcing. It's called CRO, right? So they have done that historically, and about 10 to 15 years ago, they decided most of the big pharma companies have outsourced their CRO because it wasn't a core competency, although it's absolutely essential to getting drugs out.
Right.
It's essential to what they're doing. And so those would be great candidates for vested deals. If I look at Procter & Gamble and Jones Lang LaSalle, you might think, really? Facilities management, really? But think about their employees, and their employees are their competitive advantage. So they want really happy employees that love coming to work, that love, their environment. And so their facilities is a big component of what they're doing, right? And all the properties around the world that they have, right? So it is not a core competency, but it is a huge cost for them to run that. And Jones Lang LaSalle is amazing. And so they've said, I want to work with a partner who's amazing that can help drive innovations in this area. I know in our case study, they said, I don't want someone to take care of the buildings. I want someone to take charge of the buildings. Right? And to drive innovation. So Jones Lang LaSalle is innovating, working with P&G on a daily basis to drive things. For example, they had in the Cornet magazine some adoption of a technology called smart buildings. And how that's really reducing their cost structure on maintenance.
Interesting.
And so really driving that. If I look at Microsoft, right? So back office procure to pay, right? Yeah. They're great at software development, but you know what? They got to pay the bills, and they get lots and lots and lots of bills. I mean, it's such a huge component of their operations. Because they have 116 subsidiaries, right? Being Sarbanes-Oxley compliant, so they just don't want someone to to go in and go and process an invoice. They want someone to drive innovation, risk reduction in how they manage their entire back office finance operations. So a lot of these organizations are looking at something that in the past was seen as like, oh, that's just facilities or back office procure to pay, or that's just clinical trials, right? Three dogs and a monkey can be
right.
But they're seeing great value when they look at this spend category more strategically.
Yeah, and how it has a material impact on ultimately the success and the USP of the business.
That's right. And so there are actually 25 factors. It's a component of some of our research that we've been doing for about the last 4 years. And when do you do vested? When do you do it, right? And today, most people who do vested, it's because they feel stuck. They want innovation. They want something strategic, but they're just not working for them. But technically, you should be going through your spend categories and looking at these 25 different factors. And we have a free open source tool. Like much of our work at the University of Tennessee, it's open source. But it's called Business Model Mapping Toolkit.
Okay.
And so I can share it with you. You can post it on your site for your readers and listeners to download. But they can go through and actually do the business model mapping exercise, and it will tell them which sourcing business model they should use. Transactional, kind of an output performance-based deal, or a vested deal, or in-source, because some things are so strategic and they should in-source them.
Well, I will definitely link up to that. That sounds like a really useful tool, and I'll give out the URL for the show notes at the end of the discussion. The other thing that Rob mentioned was the notion of productive collaboration. So when you look at the actions, and you talked about a lot of them, that you need to build these type of relationships, is there an 80-20? So, focus on certain activities if you can't afford to invest in all of them, or is this something that you really need to be all in on?
That's a tough question. So I think any organization, I'll rephrase, I know that any organization that applies any of the 5 rules will have a better relationship by applying any of the 5 rules.
Yeah.
However, don't expect magic to happen if you're cheating on 2 of the 5 rules. You're cheating, right? And when you cheat, it deteriorates trust. So let me give you a great example, right? So, I'm gonna create an outcome-based deal, but I'm going to measure the activities. Okay, so the supplier's paid on activities, but you're measuring on transactions. Or your supplier's being measured on outcomes, but being paid on transactions.
Yeah.
Or I'm going to drive innovation, but I'm going to tell you how to do it. Right? So the rules actually work as a system. So think about a system as your thermostat in your room, in your home, right? The it gets cold outside, it automatically comes up. So it has triggers and it works together. And what we like to think of as a sourcing business model is a system.
Yeah.
So you're architecting a system for that relationship. So based on the nuances of those, you should go through each of the 5 rules, the buyer and the supplier together, sitting down, discussing the rule, making decisions on how they're going to manifest that rule and contract for that. And so you can cherry pick them and you will get benefits, and we see that. But you see exponential benefit when you take the time to actually go through, learn the rule, and follow the rule. Mm-hmm. And, that's, and think about it, some of these deals are multiples of millions, billions of dollars.
Right.
So these big companies, why wouldn't you want to spend the time to get it right instead of cheat on the rule?
Yeah, I guess that's part of the building the business case up front, isn't it? That, this is the outcome, but you really need to be focused on all the different rules and all the principles within the rules to really get the ultimate ROI. And if you don't, then you may actually not get the ROI that you wanted because you're trying to do it half-baked.
Right. And so if you think about it, each of the rules, right? So we go through, and when we teach people how to craft vested agreements, the online course is 17 modules, and we recommend one module a week. So about little over 4 months, right? And so you can actually go through a relationship and structure that relationship in about 4 months. That's about the same time you're going to take to negotiate a big deal anyway.
Right.
Do it right.
So as we're coming towards the end of the discussion, I know that I'm mindful of time. I had a couple of final questions. One was that, these relationships take time to build, and results aren't necessarily overnight. And for a lot of cases, it's kind of a different way of thinking. So how have you seen procurement execs or CPOs kind of manage the expectations of their stakeholders or their CFO when it doesn't necessarily realize immediate benefits when they're used to, well, I need 3% cost reduction today, or I need a 10% reduction on the price that you negotiate?
So I want to draw on a word you said. They take time to build.
Yeah.
But before you can build them, you have to architect them. And that's what we really teach is, teach people the skills of being a certified deal architect. Yeah. And so we want you to architect what you're going to build. And then the stakeholders, these various folks, finance, legal, business people, right? They're actually on the architecture team because procurement can't go off in a silo and craft a deal with a supplier that doesn't meet the business expectations or the finance expectations. And so often what we see is that on the buy side, the stakeholders within the buyer community, business is not aligned with finance, is not aligned with legal, is not aligned with procurement. And so they are not on the same page. And so by creating a deal architecture team with the right stakeholders on that team to architect the deal, they get aligned.
Right.
And they set the directions for what they should expect. And what they are expecting depends on how big and lofty their goals are. Are they going to the moon? Are they going to Mount Everest?
Yeah.
Right? So a lot of these vested deals are transformational in nature. The title of our first book is called Vested Outsourcing, 5 Books That Will Transform Outsourcing. And so you want to use a vested relationship when you're buying the future. You want someone to take charge of the buildings, not just take care of them. You want to solve some of these wicked problems, as P&G said, or BHAGs, as Microsoft would call them, right?
So, and it's all about getting everybody aligned up front, I guess, then, and everyone's on the same sheet from the very beginning so that you're kind of going into this collectively.
Yeah, and so we don't think of it as a buying and selling, right? Yeah. So you buy and sell on the lower end of the sourcing continuum.
Yeah.
But as you get into these very strategic deals, it is a collaborative relationship where the buyer and the supplier are aligning against the rules of that relationship. And those, you got 5 rules. And so it's really a discussion point, and it's learning why those rules are important, what the decisions are for that rule, and then putting it down in a contract. So we're all real clear, black and white, what it means to be successful against where we're going.
So my last question, and this is more of a personal question, I guess. It's been, 10, 15 years since you've been on the journey. What's the biggest things that have surprised you as you have kind of progressed the idea of vested and the vested methodology?
Well, our first book actually launched in 2010.
Okay.
So we came out with our first research, and we started our research in 2003, and we came out with our first book in 2010. And so if you look at Vested's 6 years old now. And so on one hand, I get so frustrated and think, oh my gosh, this is taking forever. And then on the other hand, you look back and you think, oh my gosh, look how much we've accomplished. Right. It's shocking. It is absolutely shocking when you think that companies like Dell, Intel, Discovery Health Medical Scheme, Novartis, TD Bank, these amazing companies have used the vested methodology and had shocking results. Like in the Dell case study, they reduced their cost structure by almost 50%.
Wow.
They had a 32% cost structure reduction in the first 9 months.
Yeah.
People said the innovation pinata appeared out of nowhere, And so on one hand, I think, it just takes forever. Change, just people don't get it, right? And then on the other hand, you look back and we've got such a nice collection of case studies now. And I think that is, if I look at Jeffrey Moore's book, Crossing the Chasm, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, right?
Yes. Yeah.
I look at this big chasm And you know what? We've got those early adopters, and the more that they're comfortable now, they've had successes, and they'll kind of, I'll say, come out, right? They'll come and say, well, this actually does work. Being nice to your supplier, looking at outcomes, win-win, win-win's not just a nice thing to say, it's real. So the more that these organizations come out and share their success stories, the more others want to follow, because vested is different. And people have to understand different in order to do different. And that's why we really tie in the educational component. Because if you don't know what different is, you're not going to do different.
And so is that what's next then? Is it taking it from that innovators and early adopters phases that Jeffrey Moore talks about? Or is it taking it mainstream?
Yes. And so one of the ways that we do that is through our Certified Deal Architect program. And so training people on the buyer side, the supplier side, consultants and lawyers. For example, in the Nordics, we have the second largest law firm in the Nordics. And they are one of our centers of excellence because, not everybody can come to the University of Tennessee. And,
right.
And a lot of people, about half of these big organizations, want someone to help them. They're like, this is different. This is risky. I want you to be my coach. And so we have coaches that are trained in our methodology. And so today we have 5 organizations that are part of our Center of Excellence program. And we're actually going to be bringing on another 5 here in this year that are in the process of going through finalizing their training and getting up to speed. It's just, we model it after a Six Sigma Black Belt program, right? So they... you can go and learn and be a green belt, but you have to do to be a black belt.
Right.
And we want these black belts out in the marketplace, not just as coaches, but plants in the companies. So, for example, TD Bank has 3 certified deal architects. Their supplier has 2 certified deal architects. Vancouver Coastal Health, they have 3 and their supplier has 2. So it is a wonderful thing that we now are starting to get these people who are skilled to go in and craft these deals themselves.
And actually, that's a powerful statement from the practitioner side, from an organizational side, that you have these deal architects actually on staff, because it shows that this is more than just talk, that you're just trying to find another way to essentially screw your supplier using different language. You're actually serious about the concept and serious about building these relationships.
Yeah, and it's great. And once people go through and have done a deal, the thing that really makes me smile, it is just so rewarding as an academic, is they come back and they go, oh my gosh, it worked. And they want to tell everybody. Right. And so they're telling people, they're like, we've got to do this. Right. So they're so passionate because they've seen the old way and they've seen the new way. And they know the new way works and it's better, but it's different. And so our biggest challenge is different is okay.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've run to the top of the hour, so I have to wrap up here. But one last thing is just, if listeners are interested in learning more, where would be the best place for them to check out Vested, to check out the methodology, and learn a little bit more about what it is that you're teaching?
I would definitely say check out our website because we have tons of open source material. You can download all of our white papers. Our short case studies are all open source. We've got an open source toolkit that you can download. One of our courses, our Vested Orientation course, so you can take about 4 hours online for free. Just what is vested? Yep. What's it like, right? And so then if people feel like it is something that is good for them, I would encourage them to reach out, take one of our more advanced courses, our Creating a Vested Agreement. Come to our courses. We're doing our courses this twice in Europe this fall, Stockholm and Vienna, and then in Knoxville in November. And so we have a 3-day open class, open enrollment, so people are able to come in, bring a real problem. They actually do a self-assessment. We love it when they bring their business partner, like their supplier.
Yeah.
So they can bring their supplier, they can assess a relationship and develop a roadmap for where they need to go to improve that relationship.
Awesome. What I'll do is I will link up to those details in the show notes and also the business model mapping toolkit that you referenced earlier. I'll put those at artofprocurement.com/vested. That's artofprocurement.com/vested. So, Kate, you've been very generous of your time today and sharing a little bit more about Vested with me. So thank you very much for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me.
No, you're welcome. It's my pleasure. Hi there, and it's Phil here again. After I finished editing the interview with Kate, started to work with her on a vested giveaway for one lucky Art of Procurement listener. And I'm really excited to say that I launched the giveaway today. So in the bundle, Kate has provided all 5 books within the Vested series, plus a scholarship to the Vested course, 5 rules that will transform business relationships. If you want a chance to win, then just go to artofprocurement.com/vested giveaway. That's all one word. That's artofprocurement.com/vested giveaway. And the great thing with the contest is that if you enter, you'll actually receive a lucky URL. And if other people sign up using your URL, your lucky URL, then it will give you more entries into the draw. And why that's great for something like a giveaway that includes books is that unless you're superhuman, you're not going to be able to read 5 books all at the same time. So if you share that lucky URL with peers across your team, for example, and you all enter, then it's really going to increase the chances that you all collectively have of winning the prize and being able to read the books. So again, that URL is artofprocurement.com/vested giveaway. And I'll also include the link in the show notes because I know that I've given a few links today. That's just going to be, if you recall, artofprocurement.com/vested. All right, thanks a lot. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.